John Jones is a bad guy who's trying to be a good guy.
Another thing I remember about George is he would not stop a technique ever until it was perfect.
We're all familiar with the GOAT debate, and whenever I have in said debate, two names always get mentioned: the French-Canadian George Rush St. Pierre and the American John Bones Jones. GSP dominated the welterweight division from 2007 to 2013 and even got another title in 2017. John Jones, on the other hand, on and off dominated the light heavyweight division from 2011 and 2019, but his best consecutive run was 2011 to 2015. Now both these men have had spectacular careers, but who's had the better career and who really is the GOAT? Now, to give a direct and 100% correct answer is virtually impossible to do because a lot of it does come down to opinion, but I'm going to try my absolute best to give an objective answer to who the MMA GOAT is. Now, the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to go through both of these guys' rise and peaks in the sport, who they beat, how they beat them, and then I will also go over some complaints for these guys' careers which are normally used as criticisms for them, and try to see if these criticisms are justified. With John Jones, I'm sure you can imagine some of the criticisms, but anyway, let's get straight into it. Starting off with John Jones, who would make his debut against Andrew Kuzmau at UFC 87 and win by decision. Then he would fight well-known fighter, tough season 1 finalist Stephen Bonner and win another decision. Then he would get his first UFC finish by submitting Jake O'Brien. Then he would lose to Matt Hamill. Doesn't really count. And then he'd beat Brandon Vera, which might not stand out, but he actually did become a championship in one champion, so that's a genuinely good win. Then he would beat Vladimir Machishenko by TKOing him with elbows. Then he'd beat Ryan Bader, who would go on to be a double champ in Bellator. Then he'd beat Shogun to get the belt, who Shogun is a legend, 2005 Pride champion. GSP, on the other hand, would make his debut at UFC 46, getting a decision win over Karol Parisian. And then he would beat
this guy, when I was young, was beating me up in the bus all the time. But he was kind of the guy that was all the girls liked. He was like the taller, stronger guy, so he was kind of the alpha guy at the time. My dream when I was young, that's why I did UFC. I wanted to be the stronger man in the world.
And he kind of just tapped out because he was panicking. There was only a second left in the round. A loss is a loss.
So I come back and fight Dave Stresser and win by submission. And then he tried to as hard as I can. I knew I was doing the right thing. I was like, man, these guys, next time they mess with me, they know at least I had an easy target.
Then he defeats Sean Shirk, who was a former lightweight champion as well, and then BJ Penn, who was another former lightweight and welterweight champion of the world. Then he avenged one loss to Matt Hughes by TKOing him with a head kick and follow-up punches to get the belt. Now, if we look at my very detailed PowerPoint, okay, we can look at the official stats. GSP went 8-1 leading up to getting the title with 3 KOs, 2 submissions, and he beat 3 former champions to do that. Now I'm going to rank those wins, and as you can see, they have a letter next to them. Obviously, D's the worst, then it goes C, B, A, and it goes all the way to S, and I count S as all-time great wins. Okay, so for GSP, he has Matt Hughes, which is an all-time great win. BJ Penn, another all-time great win. Sean Shirk, which I class as a really, really good resume, a name to have on your resume. A, Frank Trigg, former title challenger. B, Caro was really good at the time. Fucked up his career, but he was really good at the time. Count him as a B. Mayhem Miller's obviously very known, but more for his antics. He's C. And then the other guys, a D, because they're relatively nobodies if we're being honest. Then, if we look at John Jones, John Jones went 7-1 with 3 KOs, 2 submissions, and he beat 0 former UFC champions. He beat Shogun, which I class as an A. Then he beat Ryan Bader, which is another A, because he was a double champ in Bellator. And obviously Bellator is easier than the UFC, but to be a double champ in what for a long time was the second best MMA promotion in the world is a great feat. And in his prime, if you think he can compete in the UFC, you're crazy, okay? Then you got Brandon Vera, who went on to be a champion in one championship, who has got better in recent years and is probably now the second best MMA organization. But at the time of him being champion, wasn't the case. Then we got Stephan Bonner, who's obviously known mostly from Tough, but if we're being honest, the UFC run was very mixed. Then the other guys we got Vladimir, who I class as a C, and then Jacob Bryan and Andre Guzman, in my opinion, interchangeable. Those are both D class wins in my opinion. Now, if we're being entirely honest, and if we're looking at this objectively, GSP clearly had much better names on his resume and a much harder road to the title than Jon Jones has. The only thing that Jon has over GSP is that his loss was a disqualification and wasn't a traditional loss. But if we're looking at it, Jon doesn't have a single S-tier win, where GSP has 2. In my opinion, for the Rise, GSP very clearly wins. Very clearly wins. Now moving on to their peaks and when they were at the top, starting off with Jon Jones, who would defeat Quinton Rampage Jackson by submission in the 4th round, and then would also defeat Lyoto Machida by submission again in the 2nd round. Then he would have a fiery fight with Rashad Evans with a lot of beef around it, which he would dominate that fight. Then he'd have some trouble against Vitor Belfort, but he'd overall dominate, eventually getting the crucifix and then a submission. Then stepping up from middleweight would be Chael Sonnen, who Jon Jones would dispose of quickly in under a round. Then would be Jon's hardest fight up to this point, Alexander Gustafsson. This fight is in the Hall of Fame, one of the greatest fights of all time. It really could have gone either way. The general consensus is that Gus won the first 2 rounds, Jon won the last 2. It all comes down to that 3rd round. But Jon ended up getting his hand raised, and it's not an egregious decision or anything like that, so it's nothing to really pick at. He would then fight Glover Teixeira, absolutely dominating him, and then he would fight Daniel Cormier, who is Jon's best win on his resume, and he would dominate him for 5 rounds. Then obviously Jon would have a lot of legal trouble, which he's known for, and then he won't fight for about 1.5 years, fighting St. Peru, who in a lackluster fight he'd win a decision against. Then he would knock out DC in the 3rd round, but would get overturned to a no contest, so I'm going to count that as null and void. Then coming back after 1.5 years, Jon would fight Gus in a rematch, absolutely dominating him and finish him in the 3rd. Then he'd dominate Anthony Smith. But after this, it wasn't looking so good. He'd have a split decision against Thiago Santos, who would go 2-8 in his MMA career after this, never mind UFC career. And then he would get a robbery victory against Dominic Reyes. And I'm not hearing you out on that. Dominic Reyes was robbed in that fight. That should be a loss. Then Jon would make his return 3 years later, submitting Cyril Gane in just 2 minutes. Now with GSP, after defeating Matt Hughes and winning the belt, he would lose it immediately to Matt Serra in one of the biggest underdog wins in UFC history. After that, he would win another 2 fights, beating Josh Koscheck and then defeating Matt Hughes by submission. Then he would also defeat Matt Serra to avenge his loss. And then he would beat John Fitch, BJ Penn in a rematch, Thiago Alves, Dan Hardy, Josh Koscheck again, Jake Shields, Carlos Condit, Nick Diaz. But then things would get a bit spicy when he fought Johnny Hendricks, and Johnny Hendricks got robbed in that fight. This is very similar to the Dominic Reyes situation, kind of evens it out.
George St. Pierre, then he took 4 years off and everything like that, but he's still one of the greatest, if not the greatest of all time. But George St. Pierre, he's a special guy.
Now we've gone over the peaks, and by the end of that, when we're at the end of their careers at this point, Jon Jones only has 1 fight left. We have this. GSP 26-2, 8 KOs, 6 subs, beat 6 former champs, and then the gradings, I think he has 2 all-time great wins in Matt Hughes, BJ Penn, Then he has some amazing, fantastic wins, basically being Sean Sherk, Diaz. Then we got some really good ones in Condit, Koscheck, Jade Sealed, Matt Serra, and Frank Trigg. Then, moving on to John Jones. 27-1 with 10 KOs, 7 subs, and by this point in time, he's beat 7 former UFC champions, probably going to be 8 when he beats Stipe in November. DC, all-time great win. Then it's pretty much A's across the board. Rampage, Shogun, Machida, Rashad, Vitor, Gus, Golova. Then we got 2 B's at the bottom in Garn, who can maybe get up to A one day, and then Chow as well for B. Now when it comes to this, I think it's a lot harder to judge, but I think you've got to give it John Jones, man. That amount of former champs on your list is crazy. And I think DC is better than any of GSP's wins. So now for the final segment of this video, I want to go over the main complaints that will be thrown at these guys, and then I'll give my opinion on who I personally think the GOAT is. Okay, first we got GSP. His resume ain't that good. He fought nobodies. We've gone through it in this video. That's bullshit. There's not much that needs to be said. That is a very narrow-minded, recency biased mindset. Bullshit. Okay, stupid point. Then with John Jones. Okay, first of all, tested positive. Okay, multiple times. That is the biggest thing on John Jones, so that means a lot to me, because why that doesn't help with your fight IQ, which in my opinion is John's biggest and best asset. I'm sure he would say something else, but that's my opinion. But it helps like physically, you know what I mean? He's already extremely physically gifted, but for me that does impact, you know what I mean? And GSP was a big fan of improved drug testing within the UFC. And another thing with John is that this whole thing about how his opponents were pretty much middleweights and old. You're half correct. They weren't old. Most of these guys were in their prime. Okay, they were in their early 30s. They were in their prime. He fought them. Some of them were maybe just exiting it, like 33, 34. But these were not old men. The height is a more valid concern, because the average height of a light heavyweight back then was 5'11", and now it's nearly 6'1". So that is a valid concern. How much you take that into account is up to you. Now for me personally, I think GSP is the GOAT because, you know, I'm a big no drug guy. I think that means a lot. But do you see how difficult it is to give an objective answer? You can't. I tried. I gave everything, and there's not an objective answer that you can give. It's literally impossible. But for me, if you don't care about drugs, it'd be John. If you do, it's GSP, and that's my take. Anyway, I'm out, man. Like, subscribe, do all that. In a bit, much love. Goodbye.